welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I am Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We're back with The Federalist, lecture number 7 today, Why the Articles of Confederation Failed.
And not to give you whiplash, because in the last lecture we said we were switching from theory to institutions, but for a reason which becomes clear as you hear the lecture, Dr. Pestritto goes back to the Articles of Confederation and the arguments for why it needed to be replaced, which can be summed up, as they are by Hamilton quite nicely, as under the Articles of Confederation, Americans had neither troops, nor treasury, nor government. What does that mean, Juan?
Well, first, this is very relatable, I think. And as you get into the lecture, you'll see why. We've all experienced this, I think, at work or in groups that we've been a part of, institutions that we've been a part of, where there's no clear structure of authority. There's no clear who makes the final call on a decision that needs to be made. And therefore, no decision is ever made and things just... nothing happens.
Right.
And I think that's what you're seeing here happening in the country at large.
The Articles of Confederation say that the national government can request funds from the states for the common treasury through a quota system. And they can request men for the military when there's need for national defense. But there's no enforcement mechanism. It relies on the states to honor their commitment, honor their word. And sometimes states, just like sometimes people, don't want to do that. And so it turns out in practice, the states were not sending the right amount of money, and they were not sending men when called. And so you have a national government that's a government in name only, but it can't perform its main function, which is protecting the rights of the people. You need money, and you need men to do that. You need to be able to defend from foreign enemies, and if you don't have a military budget and you don't have soldiers, you can't do what you're supposed to do. So we know from the Declaration of Independence that when a government is not performing its primary purpose, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. So the Americans at the Constitutional Convention went about altering their form of government.
If you're enjoying this podcast and you're learning from it, we encourage you to follow us. It's one of the best ways that actually you can help us. If you're listening to us on iTunes, podcast, or Spotify, or anywhere else that you're listening to us, hit that follow button. It'll help us tremendously to gain a bigger audience and teach more and more people about this great lessons, especially from the Federalist now.
And there's a host of other ways you can learn from Hillsdale College through our podcast network. There's many other podcasts, including the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, which has frequent occurrences of interesting guests, the K-12 Classical Education Podcast, Primus, and the Larry Arnn Show. Plenty to learn here with Hillsdale College.
And now let's turn to Lecture 7 of The Federalist, Why the Articles of Confederation Failed.
In our last session, we talked about Congress and the House of Representatives in particular, and we have to bear in mind that there was an existing Congress when these papers were written. It was the legislature under the Articles of Confederation, and that provides a very nice contrast to Congress as the Federalists designed it in the new Constitution. A consideration of the Articles of Confederation will be an important part of what we're going to talk about in today's session. We're going to examine the nature of union and the role of both the states and the national government as Publius envisions it. For much of the remainder of the course, we're going to go on to talk about our national institutions, more on the legislature, on the executive, on the judiciary, and how these institutions relate to one another. One might say that's kind of the horizontal arrangement of institutions. But of course, there's another very important feature of our system, and it's the subject of many, many Federalist papers, almost the entire first half of the book, and that's the vertical relationship. National government to state governments to local governments. And that arrangement, too, commands much of Publius's attention. That first half of the book breaks roughly into 3 parts. Papers 3 to 14 address the necessity of union. That is to say, why is it that we need a union at all? What are the advantages of union? What dangers might come if we emerge from this debate without a strong union? Having in those papers established the necessity of union, Publius will then turn in papers 15 through 22 to criticizing the Articles of Confederation as being insufficient for the purposes of union. And then finally, in papers 23 through 36, Publius turns his attention to describing a government that will be sufficient for the purposes of union. Now, when we talk about this vertical arrangement in our Constitution, the relationship between the national government, state government, local governments. There's a common assumption, especially among conservatives. And that common assumption is that anything associated with the founding, with the Constitution, with the older traditions in our republic must be in favor of more decentralization. That if they look back into the older documents, what they're going to find is an argument for more state power and less federal power. And in fact, as I'm sure has become clear by now, that's simply not the case about the Federalist Papers. In fact, the whole point of the Federalist is to make the case for a national government that is more energetic, that is firmer, that has more powers, that can do more than the national government had been able to do under the Articles of Confederation. In fact, the argument of the Federalist is that there was too much decentralization under the Articles of Confederation. So much decentralization that essentially the states were in charge. And we know from the Federalist what Publius thought of how the states were conducting their affairs in the 1780s. He was very skeptical of much of state government. Having said that, we should be very clear. This doesn't mean that the Federalists could even have imagined the powers of the national government today, that they could even have imagined the way in which the national government has come to almost completely eclipse the authority of states. It was simply assumed at this time, and certainly assumed by the Federalists, that the states would still retain most ordinary powers of government, what we refer to as the police powers. Regulation of the public's safety, health, morals. These are ordinary things that are obviously reserved for the state or even for the local level. The Federalists understood that. Everybody understood that. They didn't think much need to be said about it. However, there were certain powers lacking at the national level, and that needed to be remedied. And that's the argument of the Federalist. What the Federalist was principally concerned about were things that pertain to the nation as a whole. Things like foreign affairs, things like commercial treaties with foreign powers, interstate commerce, matters over which the government under the Articles of Confederation had insufficient control. After all, the purpose of government, as we know from the Declaration, is to secure the rights of citizens. Well, securing rights does require government to have some power. Life and liberty and property have to be protected. That requires government to make laws. It requires government to use coercion to enforce those laws. And the Federalists believed that power was lacking at the national level. So let's look to the Articles of Confederation and specifically to the legislature. This is really the only institution that mattered. It was the only institution with any power, such as it was. One of Publius's main criticisms of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation is that it was a Congress in the dictionary definition sense of the term. Because technically, a Congress refers to a meeting of sovereign entities. Congress is kind of a diplomatic term historically. You might think of something like the United Nations General Assembly as fitting the definition of a Congress. This is an assembly where sovereign nations come together, where sovereign nations send a representative along with other equally sovereign nations. And if you think about something like the United Nations, it often passes resolutions, but those resolutions lack force. It's up to the member states, the member nations, whether or not they're going to agree with particular resolutions. They can enforce them in their own borders or not as they see fit. And there's no presumption that the representatives who are sent to the United Nations work for the United Nations. No, they're there to represent their own sovereign countries. This is the essential characteristic of Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Each state sends a delegation to the Congress. They can choose the number of representatives that they send within a certain range. And very importantly, the representatives in the National Congress are paid by the states. They're employees of the states. That's very different than the Congress under the Constitution, where the representatives are federal employees. They're paid by the federal government. Under the Articles of Confederation, there's an executive, but it doesn't really exist in any serious way. The executive is essentially a standing committee of the Congress. It's a plural executive. It basically is an executive that's designed to mirror the way the executive functioned under the Continental Congress when the Revolutionary War was being fought. And one of the defenses of the design is to say, well, it worked for us when we were fighting off the British, so let's just mimic that in our new form of government. Now, Publius's response to that is, we should see that for what it was. We were graced by Providence. We're very fortunate that that worked, and we shouldn't try to build a real system of government on that principle going forward. The great difference between the Congress under the Articles and the Congress as it's designed in the Constitution is that the Congress of the Constitution is designed to represent a union of people. The people are sovereign. If you think back to our session on the Anti-Federalists, you'll recall that this was a point of dispute between the Federalist and especially the Anti-Federalist Patrick Henry. And you may recall that we quoted from Patrick Henry's speech at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. Patrick Henry was very indignant that the preamble to the Constitution did not use the words, "we the states ordain and establish the Constitution." Instead, the preamble says what? "We the people." And so Publius thought it very important that the Congress, as designed under the new Constitution, was seen as representing the people in their sovereign capacity. One of the very first statements that's made by Publius in Federalist 15, where he's addressing the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation, is that the point here is to preserve the Union. And that's an important way of putting it. The Union is already there, and it's about preserving the Union that already exists. And so the consenting authority is the people themselves, and the Congress should represent the people. There should be a direct relationship between the people, as individuals, and the legislative body of the nation. This is a paper where Publius is at his most direct about what the role of the states will be in the new system. Often we find Publius reassuring the states that their role will not be unduly diminished, and of course that's the case. However, he's upfront here in 15 that the states will have to cede some authority. And he's also upfront that the people have the power to do that. Remember, the states are not the ones making the social contract here. The people are. And the people can empower the national government. They can reduce its power. The people can empower states. They can reduce state power. That's up to them. This is why, as Publius will go on to say in a later paper, the Constitution itself has to be ratified not by state governments, but by the people represented in conventions in particular states. There's another very interesting point that comes from the rhetoric used in Federalist 15. Publius, in criticizing the government of the Articles of Confederation, appeals to our pride. This is what he says. "We may indeed with propriety be said to have reached almost the last stage of national humiliation. There is scarcely anything that can wound the pride or degrade the character of an independent people which we do not experience." Now that's government under the Articles for Publius. It is humiliating. It wounds our pride. Now, if we think about that for a minute, it's interesting that Publius would appeal to pride there, isn't it? Because pride can also be a pretty dangerous thing in a republic. One of the reasons he worries that states are going to be fighting with each other all the time is that human beings are prideful, and that for petty, prideful reasons they'll get into disputes and wars with one another. So pride can be a part of human nature that we should really worry about, that needs to be guarded against. But here, Publius is appealing to a different element of our pride, a different kind of pride, a pride we have as citizens, a pride we have as Americans, and is trying to get his audience to think about how outsiders will be viewing us, and they are going to be laughing at us. Look at how our government has been conducted over the last several years. Look at all the problems that we've been having. We were told by these outsiders we couldn't make a republic work, and we're proving them right. And isn't that humiliating? And this points to an interesting feature of the book as a whole. Pride is frequently mentioned in the book, but it's mentioned in two different ways. There is the narrow, passionate kind of pride, which leads us into conflict and which has to be mitigated and controlled by the institutions of government. But there's also a pride that we ought to have in our republicanism, in the superiority of our form of government, in the fact, going all the way back to the first Federalist paper, that Publius claims we're going to show by this Constitution that Republican government can be made to work. Probably the best example of Publius's appeal to this kind of pride comes at the end of Federalist number 11. This is where Publius is talking about the important commercial strength that will come out of a new and stronger union. It's a very entertaining rhetorical flourish, and Publius is reminding us that the Europeans are watching us, that they have a kind of superior attitude with respect to we Americans, and wouldn't it be great to put them in their place? He says, Europe, by her arms and by her negotiations, by force and by fraud, has in different degrees extended her dominion. Africa, Asia, and America have successively felt her domination. The superiority she has long maintained has tempted her to plume herself as mistress of the world and to consider the rest of mankind as created for her benefit. Men admired as profound philosophers have in direct terms attributed to her inhabitants a physical superiority, and have gravely asserted that all animals, and with them the human species, degenerate in America, that even dogs cease to bark after having breathed a while in our atmosphere. So he's really reminding his audience of how pretentious the Europeans are. And, if this makes you mad, if this pricks your pride, and you want to do something about it, well, what should you do? Well, you should vote for the Constitution. Remember, the immediate aim of the book is to win the debate. And note how he draws on this appeal to our pride as Republicans and uses that and draws on it to make the case for ratification. He continues, facts have too long supported these arrogant pretensions of the European. In other words, so far, we're proving them right. Let's not continue to go down this road. What will enable us to turn it around? Union will enable us to do it. Disunion will add another victim to his triumphs. Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to the control of all transatlantic force or influence. Right? Let's show those Europeans how we do self-government and how our government, by adopting the Constitution, will be superior to theirs.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you find your audio.
So if the Articles of Confederation are so humiliating, and if we need to come up with a different vertical arrangement, a different structure to our union, and a different relationship between the national government and the state governments and local governments, well, what should that arrangement be? In order to understand Publius's vision for this, there's no better paper than number 39. Number 39, written by James Madison, first addresses itself to the problem of terminology. Publius says in that paper that the problem coming into this debate is that we tend to have two extremes in how we view the structure of a union. On one extreme, we think there can be what we call a confederation or a federation, and these terms are often used interchangeably. And in this model of a confederation, it's basically like the Articles of Confederation. The states or the constituent units have all of the authority. They are sovereign, and to the extent that there's a national government, its power is entirely dependent on the consent and on the good graces of those constituent or smaller states. And Publius takes us in various parts of the book through different examples of historical confederacies, from ancient Greece into the various European confederacies. So that's one extreme. On the other extreme, we can have a national form of government, or what is also referred to as a consolidated form of government. And this is a form of government where there might be constituent units, there might be what we call states, but these states only exist and only exercise the powers that the national government gives them. And there are many good examples of this form of government today in Western Europe, where there are often constituent subdivisions of authority, but they are basically administrative units of the national government. So if we look at things that way, we can either have a federation or a national system. The anti-federalists, you can understand, they're in favor of a federation. However, what the Federalists want to argue is that there is a third way. There is a middle ground. And this middle ground is neither a wholly national system, nor is it a wholly federal system. And that's the system they believe they've designed under the Constitution. As Publius will put it at the very end of number 39, the proposed Constitution, therefore, even when tested by the rules laid down by its antagonists, is in strictness neither a national nor a federal constitution, but a composition of both. Well, what does that mean, to be a composition of both? How can a system be partly national and partly federal? Well, one of the things that Publius does in number 39 is he says, okay, let's go through and let's look at the different parts of the Constitution and let's describe them. Let's look at one institution and see if it's national or federal, and let's do that institution by institution and arrangement by arrangement. And that's what he does. It's actually a very good paper for going through all the different elements of the system. And so if we do it that way, and we think about the system under the Constitution, what would be some of the federal elements? Well, most obviously, you would think of the Senate. Right? The Senate is an institution where its representatives are chosen by the state governments. Remember, this is prior to the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment brought in direct election of senators, but prior to that, the state governments, the state legislatures in particular, chose the senators. So the Senate cannot even exist unless the states do something in an affirmative fashion. That's clearly what Madison would describe as a federal feature. On the other hand, an institution like the House of Representatives would clearly be, by the same principle, a national feature. There's no involvement of state government, or I should say very little involvement of state government. The states have to facilitate the elections, of course, but members of the House of Representatives are elected directly by the people. The qualifications for those voting for members of the House of Representatives are laid out in the Constitution. And the members of the House of Representatives don't really have any interaction with state government. They're not understood to represent state governments. They represent the people themselves. So that's a national feature. If we look at an institution like the executive, Publius says that's more of a mixed situation. There are certain national elements of the executive. On the other hand, the executive is chosen by an electoral college, and that college meets in states. And so there's lots of different elements that are a mix of both to the executive. Another distinction that Publius makes in terms of talking about national and federal is to say that the extent of power is a federal feature, but the operation of power is a national feature. What does he mean by that? The extent of power simply means how much power does the national government have? The powers of the national government are enumerated. Its powers are not general, they're not plenary. The powers of the national government are defined, and if they're not named or enumerated, they are presumed to reside with the states or the people themselves. So in that sense, the extent of power is a federal situation. However, with respect to those powers that the national government is given. Their operation is national. So if the national government has the authority under the Constitution to make a particular law, that law operates directly on the people themselves. It does not depend upon state governments. It does not depend upon state law enforcement. The national government, if it is given the power to make a law, may enforce that law on citizens directly. And that corrects a major defect in Publius's view of the way it worked under the Articles of Confederation. So if you go through all the different arrangements and all the different institutions, number 39 concludes some are federal, some are national, some are mixed. And so the system that we have is, as he says, partly federal, partly national. It doesn't fall neatly into just one category or the other. One other very important point about number 39 is that it shows the limits to the influence that the example of Rome had on our framers. We've said already that they were very influenced by the Roman example, and that they often modeled themselves on their understanding of Roman statesmen. And this is certainly true, and it's very obvious in many parts of the book. However, for those of you who may have watched the college's online course on the Roman Republic, you may recall that Dr. Calvert makes a very important point in the final session of that course. His point is also that there are limits to the Roman example. And I want to come around to that point by reading from another part of number 39. And this is a part where Publius defines what a republic is. Now, we've been saying all along that one of the most important missions of the book is to teach what republicanism is. And finally, we get to number 39, and he just gives us a definition of it. We may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all its powers, directly or indirectly, from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, for a limited period, or during good behavior. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. So, in order to be a republic, the institutions that govern have to be drawn from the whole people. Citizens are equal. One class of citizens isn't superior to another. No one class of citizens gets their own institution or gets their own part of the government. And this is a very important departure from the classical understanding of republicanism. The Roman Republic, after all, was based on the model of what's called a mixed regime, where different institutions represented different classes. You had the Senate, for example, which represented the aristocracy. Not everybody was represented in the Senate. That institution was reserved just for a favored class. You had the tribunes, on the other hand, which represented the people, another part, not the whole society. So by Publius's definition, the Roman Republic was not, properly speaking, a republic. It did not have the essential element. And this is a point that is made in our course on the Roman Republic. What makes us different, the reason why Publius has to define a republic to include the whole society, no institution excluding any part, is because we have the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. This means that no one is born with the right to govern another without the other's consent. And you can't understand the Federalists' view of republicanism without understanding that fact. And 39 is a great paper for bringing that out, and as much as we are influenced by the classical examples, that is something that's very, very different in the American tradition.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including Ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.